Welcome back to Andersen Acres. I'm once again going to make something with just plain white dough because people keep asking, what are other things I can do? So we already did a pull-apart loaf. I'll link to that one in the description. This time we're going to do a savory pull-apart loaf. It's actually a lot of fun and it's delicious, excellent to stick on your table, and it's really, really easy to make. So you can use just plain white bread, just plain white dough, which I'll link in the description to that as well, to that recipe, but you could also use a whole wheat dough, a rye dough, or even a sourdough if you like. Whatever dough you would like to use, this recipe is very versatile. So we're just going to take our dough and set it aside for a minute because we need to make our savory toppings. In here we have 2 to 3 tablespoons of Parmesan cheese. The powdered stuff works better than the grated stuff this time, just because it's easier to mix in with all your other ingredients. So to that, I'm actually going to add 2 teaspoons of sesame seed, but I'm using black sesame. I like using black sesame for this recipe just because it adds a little bit of contrast. So 2 teaspoons of black sesame seeds. Give that a little bit of a mix. I'm actually going to use a little spoon so I stop getting cheese on my hands. There we go. We also want to add a teaspoon of garlic powder. You definitely want garlic powder, okay? Don't try to use minced garlic or anything. You want a garlic powder in this mix. There we go. Now you're going to want half a teaspoon or thereabouts, you can do a little more if you like, of paprika. Okay, we're just going to get, I'm going to do a little extra. Yeah, let's do extra. But about half a teaspoon is usually sufficient for this particular mix, but you can add a little extra paprika if you like. You could also add extra garlic. Now to this, we also want to add a little bit of salt. You don't need more than about a half teaspoon or so. Okay, you don't need much. Just about a half teaspoon of salt just to punch up the flavor a little bit. You don't want to make it very salty, so don't add extra salt. So get that all mixed so that it's uniform and looking yummy. There we go. I can smell the paprika and the garlic. That's nice. Set that aside. You're also going to want about 4 tablespoons of melted butter. Set both of those aside. You're going to need them in a minute. Now you want to get your pan. I'm going to use my beautiful pan here. This is usually for making a bundt cake or anything like that, but I like using it for this because it's really pretty with presentation. And it just comes out nice, and because it has the hole in the center, it helps the dough cook really evenly. So we're using a silicone pan. If you're using a glass or a metal pan, you're going to want to really make sure it's either sprayed with your cooking spray, or you want to make sure that you have buttered and floured it really well so nothing sticks. I'm just using a few spritzes because I'm just using a silicone pan, so I don't need a ton of non-stick help here because it's pretty non-stick anyway. So we're going to take that, set it aside for a moment. Now we're going to go back to our dough. With our dough, we're going to want to cut it into 32 pieces. That means first cut it into 4. Okay, take each of those 4. I have a little flour here because this dough's a little bit sticky. So I just have a little flour here to roll them in if they get just overly sticky on me. So divide your dough into 4. Now you have 4 pieces. You're going to take each of those 4 and divide them into 4. Okay, nice and dividing. The exact size is not really that big a deal. So just divide each one into 4. Again, don't worry if they're a little bit off in sizing. It won't matter. You don't want to be terribly off, but a little bit off is not a big deal in this recipe. So now we have 16. I'm going to ditch the cutter now. What we're going to do is each of these 16 pieces, just rip them in half, okay? Rip them in half. You can wrap them in flour if you want, but I'm just literally dropping them in the pan. So get one, rip it in half, drop it in the pan. So I'm going to do probably 8 in the bottom of this, 8 pieces. So I rip it in 2, 1, 2, rip this guy in 2. So you don't even have to worry about being particularly neat. The way it rises up, it won't matter if you're neat or not. So now what we're going to do is we're going to take our basting brush, take our butter, And we're just going to brush the tops of these with butter. Be generous. You don't want to not have enough butter. The butter layer is what helps you pull them apart later, and it makes them tasty. And do not use margarine, ever. Don't use margarine in a pull-apart bread. So then we're going to take our topping, take a scoop of topping, and start shaking it on there. Remember, this is mostly Parmesan cheese. You can't really go overboard, but you do want to make sure you have enough for the other layers. So once you have that coating on, you just keep going. You just keep ripping your pieces apart and just stack them on top. So this one, we might have 10 or 12. You just keep going till it looks good to you. There we go. Yeah, you just keep going. And it doesn't matter where your pieces drop. It really has no impact. These rise up later. It's good. And I'm going to do one more here because I'm going to do one here and one in here. So then I'm going to take my butter again and drench that. Remember, be generous. You want lots of butter in there because otherwise they'll stick together and you won't have a pull-apart bread. You'll just have a loaf. So lots of butter in there. And again, topping. Don't be shy. You want your topping in there. Remember, these will rise and be bigger. So use more topping than you think you need to. There we go. Now we're going to do our last group. You'll have about 12 or 14 depending on how many you put on your second layer. And it'll vary because you might not be using the same kind of pan I'm using. But that's fine. Use whatever pan you like. That's the beauty of these. You can use any pan. I like these circular pans just because things turn out really fun. But you certainly don't need to use the same pan that I did. You can use just your regular loaf pan if that's what you want. It really does not matter at all. So we're just going to finish ripping these guys up. There we go. And then one more to go. Just kind of fill in any gaps you have. There we go. Then you're going to take your butter. You're going to want to use the rest of your butter. Definitely want to get the rest of that butter in there. There we go. Make sure everything's topped. And then just use up the rest of your topping. Now remember, this dough has already risen once. You have to have risen your dough once, no matter what kind of dough you're using. So if you're using sourdough, it might have taken you overnight. If you're using just a white dough, it would only take about an hour for the rise. But either way, you have to let the rise happen. This is its second rise. So now we're going to set this aside to rise. How long will depend on what kind of dough you used. So if you're using just a white dough, it'll only take about an hour before it's doubled in size. If you're using a whole wheat or rye, it might take 90 minutes. And if you're using sourdough, it'll probably take 2 to 4 hours. So judge your rise time based on how large the dough gets, not how long it's rising, because the type of dough you use will change the rise time. So we're going to just set this aside until it's doubled in size or thereabouts. It doesn't have to be exactly doubled in size, but it should be mostly doubled in size. I'm going to stick it in the microwave where it's damp and humid, but you can just cover it with a damp dish towel and put it in a warm location. Make sure it's a warm location. If it's too cold, it's simply not going to rise. But if you do have too much heat in your home, if it's really humid or hot where you are, you can always stick it in the fridge to slow down that rise if you need to. So we'll come back as soon as it's about doubled in size, and then we'll bake it up. All right, so our dough has risen. It is about double in size. You notice it's filled out all the cavities inside there, so it's not so haphazard now. It looks a little more normal. We're going to stick this in the oven at 375 degrees Fahrenheit for about 25 to 30 minutes. Check it at 25, but be prepared to leave it for 30. You do want it thoroughly cooked and nicely browned. So we'll come back in about half hour and check on it. All right, so our savory pull-apart bread was baking, for about half an hour, 30 minutes. So you're going to want to let it cool in the pan for 10 to 15 minutes. And you're going to want to slide that pan off. It's still a little hot. And there you have it. There's your savory pull-apart loaf ready for the dinner table. It's a lot of fun to make, a lot of fun to serve. and it will impress, I promise. If you don't like the black sesame seeds, you can always substitute them for white sesame seeds. It doesn't really matter which one you use. I just like the black because of the contrast. Thanks for joining us today here in the kitchen at Andersen Acres. We'll hope to see you tomorrow.